So what we're going to look at in this particular section is validation and error handling. And we'll start off with validation. And this is something that we haven't touched at all yet. Anybody can send anything up to our server, and our server will most likely accept it at this point. So let's take a look at what happens when we send up an empty activity to our server and see what happens with this. And if I go to Postman, and inside Module 10, we've got a post request just for an empty activity. We're literally going to send up an empty object and see what our server's response is at this time. And I'll click on send, and what we get back is a 200 OK response. So that means it's gone ahead and created an activity with absolutely nothing in it. And if we just go back to the Module 4 and get our activities, and see what we've got now, what we'll find is if we scroll down to the bottom here, we'll have an activity that's literally set to pretty much null with everything except for the GUID. And even though we're generating GUIDs on the client side, the server's more than capable of generating a GUID if we don't send up an ID. But if we do send up an ID, then it's going to use that as the ID of the activity. But this is not a good situation. We never want to be in this situation where our server just accepts anything. So we do want to look at validation on the server. And we'll also look at this on the client side a bit later as well. But what's most important and fundamentally important is that we protect our database from receiving bad data. Now, validation on the client can always be worked around, but the server-side validation cannot be worked around. And that's what we're going to focus on right now. So there's several ways of doing validation in a .NET application, and what we'll do first of all, we'll take a look at the simplest option, if you like. And I'm just going to go to my Create Activity Handler, and what we have inside here is our command and the properties that we're sending up for our command when we create a new activity. So the simplest method of validation inside a .NET application is to use data annotation attributes. And I'm just going to do it on one. I'm going to add a required attribute to the title property in this command. And what I'll need to do is bring in system component model data annotations to make use of this. And now that this is in place, and just make sure our API server restarts itself, and it has. If we go back to Postman and attempt to do the same thing that we just did, which is to create an empty activity, what we'll find now is that we get a 400 bad request. And our 400 bad request sends back quite a bit of information. It sends up the status code of 400, and it also tells us, it gives us an errors object, and it tells us which particular property is required. And we get all of this just by simply adding a little data annotation to our API. Well, that's pretty cool. But why has this happened? And let's go back to our API. And what we'll do is inside our API, inside our activities controller, let's just set a breakpoint to on our create method and take a look at what's happening when we send this particular request. Now we're going to use our debugger, so please make sure that you have inside your launch.json file, inside your VS Code folder, please make sure you've got a configuration in here for .NET attached, because we want to attach our debugger to the running process for the API. And this particular configuration is going to allow us to pick the process that we want to attach our debugger to. So with this in place, what we can do is we can go to our debug tab in VS Code, and what we want to use is the .NET Core attach option inside here. If we use the .NET Core launch, then this is going to start a new instance of our application, and we don't need to. We've already got this running. We typically use this one if we want to debug issues with our startup of our application, but my preference is just to attach it to the running process if we're just testing a method inside our application after it's already started. So I'm just going to use .NET attach and hit the play button, And what we want to do is select the process to attach to. Now on a Mac, this is nice and easy to find. It doesn't give us the full path of where the API.dll, and this is what we want to attach to, this API.dll. If you're on Windows, you're probably seeing a great big long path, and depending on your resolution, you may not see easily where the API.dll is. So if that's the case, just type in API.dll, and this will filter out all the other processes apart from this one, and this is the one we want to attach to. So this is going to start the debugger, and then I can go back to Postman, and if I send this request again, I just get the response, and I haven't hit my breakpoint. Now why is this? Well, this is down to a little bit of magic, and I'm just going to disconnect the debugger, and inside my activities controller, I have an attribute for our API controller. Now, the reason that we automatically validated our previous request is purely down to this API controller. And what this gives us automatic HTTP 400 responses, and it saves us from needing to check to see if there is a validation error. But let's just comment this out for now, just to see what's happening before it gets to that stage, because if we do use this attribute, then it doesn't even hit our breakpoints, and it simply returns the request before we get a chance to see what's happening here. So with this uncommented, let's reattach the debugger, and I'll just hit the play button again, attach the API.dll. And once this is running, I'm just going to go back and make the same request again. And this time we do hit our breakpoint. And what we can see inside our variables here, we've got the command and what we're sending up, and in this case it's all null values. And we've also got inside the list, we've got our controller context and what's going on in our activities controller. Now the part that's responsible for validation, and when we hit a validation error, then it puts the validation error into model states. And we can see if we take a look inside here that we have an error count of 1. And if we take a look at the results view, then what we can see inside here is we get our validation error, and inside the value and inside the errors we can see the error message that we're passing back as well when we hit a validation error. So this is what's going on, and there's no good reason to remove the API controller attribute. I really just wanted to demonstrate what's actually happening when we do hit a validation error. And I'm just going to play this request through to the end and disconnect the debugger again. And what we would have previously needed to do before the invention of this API controller attribute is we would need to check the model state before we returned our request, and we would need to say if the model state dot is valid with the not operator there, then we would return a bad request and pass in the model states. And if I just save this and run the request again, and I'm not going to put it through the debugger, I'm just going to remove the breakpoint. But if I run this request again now, I can see that I get my model state errors and I get the title field is required. So our API controller attribute gives us a little bit of magic here, and like I say, there's no good reason not to use this. And I'll just remove this model state as well. Another task that our API controller does for us as well is something called binding source parameter inference. And when we're sending up our activity inside our commands, then because we're using that API controller attribute, it's going to attempt to infer where this is coming from. And with an API request, there's a number of places that the data could be coming from. Most commonly it will be sent up in the body, but previously we might have needed to add a from body attribute to tell our API controller to say, hey, go ahead and look inside here for our activity in this case. But again, we don't need to use this either because we've got our API controller attribute there. Now, we're talking about validation, so that's what I'm going to go back to. And we're not going to do validation in this way. We're not going to add data annotations inside our commands like this. What we're going to look at is using fluent validation, which is going to act as a kind of middleware in between our command and our handler. And I'll just remove the data annotations as well. And like I say, what we're going to take a look at next is something referred to as fluid validation. And we'll take a look at that next.